moving away from the idea that children pose a threat to each other. And I grieve to think that some kids have gotten this message that they need to always be looking over their shoulder and live in fear, because the bottom line, I can say as a pediatrician, the bottom line these last 2 years is that children may develop a COVID infection, but they recover well from it. And I have not personally seen a single case of long COVID in my pediatric population. And they bounce pretty well. They might get sick for a few days and then they're better.
Hello and welcome to the Sunshine Parenting Podcast, where each week we talk about ideas for raising kids who become thriving adults. I'm your host, Audrey Monke. Here on the podcast, I share my experiences raising 5 kids who currently range in age from 16 to 26 and working with thousands more as a summer camp director over the past 3 decades. I'm the author of Happy Campers, and I frequently do workshops with parents, teachers, and summer camp professionals about social skills, connection, and happiness, topics I researched extensively for my master's in psychology. Hey, Sunshine Parenting listeners. I am coming to you from the middle of summer camp, and a topic that I did not think I would ever want to do another podcast episode on is COVID. Yet here I am, because I have needed to really reframe my thinking and learn how to navigate sort of the new era that we're in now with COVID. And Dr. Heather Silverberg, who's been our camp doctor here for this past week, has been really helpful to help us sort of understand and reframe our approach and be a little less fearful of COVID. So I hope my conversation with Dr. Silverberg will help you and be informative to you, especially if you're a parent thinking about sending your child to summer camp this year or deciding if it's a good choice for your family. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and this is my conversation with Dr. Heather Silverberg, which was from July 12th, 2022. Today on the podcast, I am thrilled to have a brand new guest, Dr. Heather Silverberg. Welcome.
Thanks, Audrey. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, why don't we start by just you sharing a little bit about your background as a pediatrician?
Very good. I am a full-time pediatrician at a private practice in San Diego, California. We're a large medical group at Scripps Health in San Diego. We have probably about maybe 20 pediatricians. All of us work full-time, and I became a pediatrician in my heart when I was traveling in Kenya and met some children who were playing in a very deserted landscape. And I saw them playing with some homemade toys, and I found that very compelling to see how their lives were affected by their environment and by the lack of resources. And I kind of came to the conclusion that their health would really determine their experience of their lives.
So was that the first place that you were a doctor? Or where was that?
I was actually just traveling. I was visiting a dorm mate who was in college, and I ran into some interns who had gone to a rural hospital. And so I was definitely inspired in that time to become a pediatrician.
Yeah, that's great. Well, the way we met is because you are currently the camp doctor at my camp. And so we have loved having you up here, by the way.
So we're having a great time.
We're recording this interview under some trees outside. So it's my camp studio here.
Fantastic place.
It's a very casual studio. I'll try to get someone to get a picture of us so that you can see our very formal studio here at camp. But one of the reasons that we've really enjoyed having you here is because I know I'm not alone with other camp professionals and educators who have been trying to navigate how we keep our programs running, keep our kids healthy during COVID. And going into this summer, so 2020, we weren't allowed to operate because of COVID, which now looking back, kind of crazy, but the numbers were probably lower then than they are now. But we didn't know everything then, right?
Right.
2021, last summer, we went into the summer with all kinds of protocols, very intense masking and testing and lots of figuring it out. And we went through the whole summer with not one case of COVID. And, part of that was because the Delta variant wasn't an issue until the end of the summer. And that was kind of the first of the breakthrough things that the vaccine wasn't as effective with. So our experience then, summer 2021 ended and we were like, woohoo! We
made it.
We're done. We're done with COVID. And then as this year progressed, we of course realized, oh gosh,
we're on the 6th wave.
Yeah, we're on this whatever wave. I mean, you lose track. And so of course, all camp professionals are tired of COVID.
Right.
Parents are tired of COVID. Schools are tired of COVID. Everyone's kind of like, we're done, but we're not done. It's not done with us.
Right. So it has been so tricky for professionals to navigate this and keep their charges safe, right? So you have parents who are entrusting you with the safety of their children. They believe in the camp experience, and they trust you to do the right thing by their kids. What we've seen, as you described this arc over the last 2 years, going from a place where we don't know much about it, so it made a lot of sense to be very conservative and sort of engage with that precautionary principle where we're, all disinfecting our mail and we're disinfecting our groceries and everyone's bubbling with themselves or their neighbors. So we go from this place where we just don't know very much and everyone's sort of ruled by fear, and schools slam shut because we're using the model of flu and how contagious flu is, and how much more severe it is in the youngest population compared to what we've learned about COVID, to where we are today, where we see the natural trajectory of a virus that starts out being what we describe as virulent, very unhealthy, lots of poor outcomes, to a place where it now does seem to fit more with the description that you heard naysayers using early on, saying, oh, this is just a cold. So now we're moving into that position where we're trying to catch up with our protocols and trying to think about what makes sense, because we recognize that adolescents have borne a disproportionate burden in this pandemic. And we have seen so much wreckage in their lives. Not to be dramatic, but truly the disruption in kids' social development, their experiences of their school life, their friends, their communities. Things have been pretty stressful, and children have found their world turned upside down. So now, as a camp professional, I can imagine that it is, and here at camp we're experiencing, trying to at once be responsible to our communities and protect the health of our individual campers, but also thread that needle to try to approach this in a way that reflects the lived experiences of people who develop this illness.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so that is what's been so helpful, is because you've had this experience as a physician with children. And so you've been watching the children and kind of probably children who've had COVID over the last 2 years and how it's been evolving. And what you told me the other day that has really stuck with me, and I wish you would explain, is the R-naught.
Yes.
The R-naught idea.
So I'll offer you my best grasp of it, recognizing that I'm not an epidemiologist or trained in public health, but you notice as a clinician, you notice that some things spread more easily, and you do see it sort of pick up, and you'll talk to your colleagues and you might say, hey, are you seeing a lot of this kind of rash? Are you seeing a lot of vomiting and diarrhea this week? And you notice that things spread in a predictable pattern, and the longer you're in practice, the more you sort of begin to anticipate the way you might when you're a parent. You start to recognize what it means to be two, or you might recognize what it means to be a preteen or tween. So you do see these cycles go along, and we've seen that the R-naught describes how contagious something is. So you're used to seeing contagious things in the community. So that's why we have vaccines against chickenpox. We have vaccines against measles. And when studies are done, they notice that on average, a person with a case of a disease will infect X number of people on average. And so when we start out with the COVID-19 virus, we noticed that the numbers suggested that for every one person who has it, that person infects about 3 other people. 3.3 is the number that was used. And with subsequent waves, and this is extremely predictable when you look historically at the research that's been done with the history of plagues. So you notice that as viruses develop, they engage with different strategies to spread. So it doesn't do you much good as a virus to kill all of your hosts. So things tend to get more contagious but less serious. And in fact, that's exactly what we're seeing. So with this concept that we were talking about before, R naught. So R naught is how contagious something is. So the first version of the COVID vaccine, the R naught was 3, and then the next variants, the Delta, that number started to creep up, and so it became R5, and then it became R7.
Was that the one like December, January?
That sounds right.
Like Omicron, the first of the Omicrons.
Omicron started to creep up, 11, 12, and now the most recent numbers, and you'll see if you're following the news, you'll see that people are talking about that now the Omicron subvariant B5 has taken over as the dominant variant in this country. It's responsible for approximately 60% of new cases, and it started in South Africa and moved as a wave across Europe, and now it's here and prevalent in our state here where we have camp. And it's being described as an R naught of 18. Mm-hmm. And why that's so, R18, R19 are two figures I've read. And one of the really striking things about that is that's on par with measles. And everyone knows we have a measles vaccine, particularly because it is so contagious. So it leads to outbreaks. Right. And so measles is described as the most contagious disease known to humankind. Mm-hmm. That means that this variant is almost impossible to stop when it's epidemic. So how do we as professionals who care about children and care about children's health protect our patients, our communities, but also tend to their emotional needs, their developmental needs, which are profound, because in the last 2 years I've been full time. I didn't take any time off. I didn't stop going to the office. I gowned up with all my PPE, and I still went in. I was seeing patients in the parking lot. I was rain, shine. We were out there taking care of these kids, and it was a very moving experience. But what you see is that not everyone suffered from the COVID infection, but almost everyone has suffered from the collateral damage of the pandemic. Absolutely. And we're seeing in adolescents especially, most people have heard or experienced themselves how it has affected, specifically, I would say kids, school-age kids and older, with a special emphasis on teenagers. So tweens and teens, adolescents have really been showing up in our office in rates we never saw before, complaining of mood disorders. So they have lost their lust for life. They are home and they have developed what we describe as social anxiety disorder. They don't want to go to school. They don't want to see their friends. They have anxiety and depression, and it's not been very easy to shake. Even going back to school, now that the schools are back open, they still are less likely to get together with their friends. They have to be prompted, and it becomes this sort of ironic situation where parents who would like to pull back and like to give their kids those sort of opportunities to develop their own identity, parents are being almost forced to be more involved with their kids than they were before the pandemic, and so it's disrupting a lot of what you would expect people to be doing at this point in their lives.
Well, I mean, having been working with kids now up here for 37 years, even before the pandemic, we were seeing increased numbers of kids coming here with different mental health issues that they'd been having, social anxiety issues. So this preceded the pandemic. I think we also have the combination of the screen issue, which has been something that I've written a lot about and really feel strongly about, that one of the biggest benefits of camp is the kind of tech detox from tech that kids get while they're here. So we were already seeing that before. What we saw when we reopened last summer were a little bit of what you're talking about. I'm guessing that the kids who have extreme social anxiety didn't ever make it to camp, right? Because they might not have even been able to come. The kids who did come were a little bit less mature, needing more guidance in social situations. And this year, I think they're already better, like in our perspective, because I think most of our kids have been in school and back in sports and doing more things this past year, which is great. They needed to. So I'm with you on that. And I think also something that you mentioned as we were kind of like working on some communication for our camp families is it's not just the kids, it's the families, it's the communities, it's the schools. I know 2 of my daughters are teachers and a lot of people who work at camp are educators, and they've had really rough couple of years. Having to pivot, and then also a lot of dysregulation. Like this is something that we've been talking a lot about at camp, is that people are having more trouble just kind of their emotional intelligence isn't as high maybe as it normally would be for their age, and they're sort of struggling with just maybe overreacting to things.
That's right. I hear that from the moms of my patients in my practice, and the stories range from being slightly charming, where I have a teacher mom who tells me that all of her kindergartners keep asking her when lunch is, because kids are used to being able to have free access to the cabinet, to the cupboards, to teachers who tell me that that there's such an achievement gap that they don't know that the kids are really ever going to be able to close that achievement gap, because they feel pressure to move these kids on before they've laid down this foundation. And everything in between, middle school and elementary school teachers who are telling me that just what you're saying, the kids have little capacity to self-regulate, little capacity to build friendships or resolve their own issues, that they haven't learned to share. And so these sorts of things, which are so important and require being with other kids.
Right.
And so that's why camp's so important, right? Because it's a chance for kids to run wild and be feral. And we can still responsibly do that, I believe, in the pandemic, because the precautions that you've put into place are reasonable. And so I think that we just need a reasonable standard. So, for instance, cohorting larger groups of kids, so in schools that might look like classrooms. At camp it might look like cabins. But still moving away from the idea that children pose a threat to each other. And I grieve to think that some kids have gotten this message that they need to always be looking over their shoulder and live in fear, because the bottom line, I can say as a pediatrician, the bottom line these last 2 years is that children may develop a COVID infection, but they recover well from it. And I have not personally seen a single case of long COVID in my pediatric population. And they bounce pretty well. They might get sick for a few days and then they're better. And it makes me really question. And believe me, I'm as pro-vaccine as I could be. My father had polio when he was 3 years old. It changed his life. He had a disability that really impacted him, and I don't fail to appreciate the impact on older adults or vulnerable adults or people for whom the vaccine doesn't take. But to be fair, we have to let our children have their childhood, and we have to let our adolescents have their adolescence. And I think that they have been wronged, not intentionally. The like you mentioned in the beginning, nobody knew
how bad it was
going to be, and I remember sort of scratching my head and telling my patients, I don't know why, but this doesn't seem to affect children, because for a long time we hardly saw any children who got sick, and the studies have shown that the children can be infected with COVID and be asymptomatic. In fact, they tend to be asymptomatic, which really bears on your question: how do we safely have camp? And so, I guess maybe some of it is to reframe it and say we're not really having conversations as much about safety, and say, what are the values we want to promote for childhood? And so to your point about, what does it mean to come outside and play? And you've heard people talk about nature deficit disorder, and you've heard people talk about, the values of interacting with nature and the self-reliance that can come from that kind of engagement. But there's very little at stake for an individual child, and when it comes to COVID, and I am not blind to the community aspect, but I think there's just a limit to what we can ask kids to sacrifice. And I think we've done that for 2 years. And I myself, as a pediatrician and a mom, I'm ready to move on. I have my kids here. I have my older daughter's here this year, and I have my younger daughter in school. And I do ask them to mask when it's appropriate, and they do have their vaccines. But I myself think that it's absolutely the right thing for camp directors like yourself to be convening camp, to be keeping kids at camp, even if they have cold symptoms that might be COVID, because the risk that they pose to each other is minimal. And that's been played out thousands of times in my practice in the last 2 years. The kids can handle it. And I think maybe we're overlaying a little bit of our adult fears about what can happen when people get sick. We kind of, on some level, need to trust our bodies and the hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that we have, especially in childhood. To trust that they can handle this infection just like they can handle difficult social situations, and they can learn, and their bodies can learn to fight these diseases off too.
Sure. And something else you told me, which I think really rung true, was that, what we're dealing with here at camp is a healthy population.
Yeah.
Most the campers are healthy young kids. Even our counselors are, for the most part, young adults who are healthy. And there's a few of us who are older, and we're all vaccinated. Well, actually, our whole staff is vaccinated. So, and I love something that you said that stuck with me. Is you said, managing COVID is a challenge, but we, as a camp, have come to the conclusion that the benefits of camp to our campers' social experiences and mental health really outweigh any risk that they have of contracting COVID. So even if they get COVID, what we're seeing is even kids who've had COVID still end up having a positive camp experience.
That's correct. And so that is the crux of the argument. And when you train in the medical sciences, you learn to read studies and the literature, and you do your training in statistics, and you learn to read a scientific paper. And one of the first things your instructors will share with you is that you need to make sure that this study applies to your population. And so when parents engage with the CDC guidelines, for instance, it can sometimes be uncomfortable. And what I say to myself and my families is that remember that these guidelines are written for a population level messaging, right? And so, that population is going to include some very sick and vulnerable individuals who we care about, but we also have to appreciate that the guidelines that are published at the state and federal level are perhaps more general guidelines. And so I personally feel comfortable in the way I manage my family and make the choices I make. I may at times diverge from those guidelines in a thoughtful way if the guidelines don't apply to the population that I am thinking about. And so, like you were saying, I believe that it is appropriate for camps to be in session for all of the very many reasons, including the joy that the children here are experiencing, the genuine connection that they are experiencing, which they are thirsty for, the time away from devices, which I share your perspective. I can tell you that I had just a striking experience these last 2 years, seeing patients in the office where when kids came in for their well checks, I could say they clustered in one of two ways. There were the kids who were having more mood issues and were gaining weight inappropriately because they were inactive and just generally sad and disengaged and having trouble with sleep and not doing well, compared to the kids who were actually seeming to cope and adjust fine. Those two populations, it was very striking that there wasn't a lot in between. It was pretty bimodal. So the kids who were doing well, they were the ones that were still engaged in some activity, usually sports, and which gave them, of course, the social connection, and it also gave them a physical activity, which is so important for people on so many levels. And they had, of course, the support of their families, and they still had their emotional needs met. Versus the kids who were, by and large, home alone because maybe they weren't fortunate enough to have an adult who available to be home with them, and they were substituting that with screen time and different social media apps. And I would have kids, and I do have kids, unfortunately, who may spend up to 12 hours a day on their cell phones or various devices, and it is profound how that affects people. There have been lots of studies that show that social media has potentially almost like it's almost like it sets up a mirror for people.
Yes.
And it causes people to be probably less authentic in their lives, less interested in learning about themselves, and more focused on what others expect of them or value from them. And that sets up a pretty tough cascade at a very vulnerable time. And I think that it's this age group that you have here at camp that you're really saving them, right, by showing them a life without mirrors to look into, without cell phones to check, without devices to keep track of. And they are dirty, and they are happy, and they are boisterous, and there's a ruckus going on here night and day and into the early evening. And they are wild, and they are free, and they are having fun. And I don't think COVID needs to stop that because of the nature of the disease. I can imagine that there could be a pandemic at some point where we would need to alter that approach.
Right.
But for this variant that we have today,
right.
We, I think, are being responsible to our campers, taking care of what they need from us, still taking appropriate measures. It's not that we've thrown caution to the wind and we are doing nothing. It is not that. There's testing, there's masking at times, there's cohorting. All these things that are appropriate for the level of illness that we see and expect. I would say the one thing that we will need to watch is, for other variants, for other emerging diseases. You can't let down your guard. And I'm, very appreciative of all the people who are involved in our epidemiologic surveillance systems in this country. They're pretty good. And so but for where we are right now, this camp is striking a very good balance between meeting the emotional and developmental needs of the campers and still attending to the public health issues at hand.
Well, thanks for that assessment. I will just share now that what we have experienced this year is we thought we were actually we really thought we didn't have COVID in here during our first 2-week session. And we now know that's because the symptoms were presenting so mildly that we actually had a whole plan approved by the same doctor that approved our plan last year. He actually works with the fire departments in Fresno, and he oversees some of the hospital staff and kind of helps because guidelines keep having to shift at all these places. So he's been our advisor. And before camp started, the advice he gave us is that we should be testing symptomatic people with fevers and coughs.
Yeah.
And so that's what we were kind of thinking we were doing. So we were doing all the pre-camp testing, of course, of our staff, of our campers, and kind of under the assumption that we were the same as last year, that if someone tested negative and they came into camp, we're not really worried about them. And, we'll kind of keep an eye on things for a couple of days, but we should be, after the first 5 days of camp, we're kind of feeling pretty good. So session 1, it's a 2-week session, goes on. Some kids with sniffles, some symptoms, minor symptoms, actually kind of picked up most on the very last day, Friday. They were going home on Saturday. And then we started hearing from families that kids had gotten home and families had tested them because, if your kid comes home from camp with the sniffles or a headache or, some of these things, of course, you would test them. And over the subsequent 5 days following session 1, we learned that 20 campers went home from camp with COVID. And we were pretty devastated because we were like, oh my gosh, we thought we were doing so well, And then I, of course, have lots of friends in the camp industry. Yeah. And I started talking to my friends at other residential camps and learned that without exception, every camp is dealing with COVID this summer, even with testing and midweek tests, all the different kinds of protocols. So it doesn't matter what protocols they're doing, they're all still getting some COVID. So this session, you joined us. We sort of started the session with a different mindset because now we were aware, we know we had COVID. We even had some kids who were staying longer who came, had been here with us over the weekend. And a few of them were one of our first cases of this session. Yeah. In addition, we had, I believe, 4 kids who tested negative on their PCR, tested negative on their antigen, and were positive 2 days after they got to camp. So even their pre-camp testing that said they were negative, they somehow. So even with testing and all this stuff, we were like, okay, so we ended up with, a handful of kids a couple days into the session, and we were like, oh no, what are we doing? And we kind of started with our original plan, which was we got to get these kids home right away and isolating at home before they come back. But then the interesting thing that happened is we had a couple of kids who we couldn't send home because they were like an international camper, an out-of-state camper. And so we had already planned to have this sort of what we call COVID village, which is our little isolation area with its own bathroom. And what we've kind of, it's been sort of a live experiment that we've done here, I would say, over the past week and a half, because we now have seen the difference of the kids who we had stay here to recuperate versus the ones that went home. So I don't know if you want to share your perspective on, because I know you've been talking to a lot of the parents on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would add that COVID Village has a beautiful view of a sparkling high alpine lake. So these kids who are in isolation, it sounds like such a terrible word, and it is so alarming for people to hear, but isolation does not mean being alone. All these kids have been very well accompanied.
Actually, that because they're so happy, because since they're all exposed, or they all tested positive, they were unmasked, playing cards, playing games,
right,
having meals together. So it was kind of a social experience for the group that was over there this week.
So the reason that you and your friends and colleagues are having this difficulty and scratching your heads over why the protocols which promised to limit the spread aren't working is because a couple things. The nature of this virus in particular, it's a very sneaky virus. People shed it before they have symptoms. In fact, most children who are infected with COVID are asymptomatic, and we see that again and again when we do surveillance testing of families. If we have a point person in the family who's tested positive and then they go home, it's difficult to predict exactly who in the household will test positive, but usually it's sometimes it's all. Often some people have symptoms and some people don't in that household, where you expect there just to be a lot of repeated exposures. So, settings such as camp or pretty much any setting is going to really struggle to contain this variant, and that is what we were talking about earlier with the high transmissibility of this virus. So I would hope that no family would feel that there was less, that anybody was doing less than they could, because there isn't much that can be done, honestly, to eliminate this variant. You may, and even with the original variants, we were just trying to bend the curve and slow it down. So you do try to keep the people who are the most ill, although I would say does not necessarily map ideally with the most contagious. But we traditionally in medicine treat people who have symptoms as more contagious than those who do not have symptoms. And I don't know that the science bears that out. It seems that people can be super spreaders. There's all kinds of interesting findings. There are people who have high viral loads and would likely be super spreaders who have no symptoms. And then there are people, you can find people, all of whom who have the similar symptoms, and some of them shed a lot of virus and some don't. So there's a unique host interaction with this virus that we don't have a lock on yet. What we've been trying to do at camp is preserve the camp experience of both children who are ill and not ill, and so recognizing the huge health benefits of being in camp, allowing people when they are well enough to participate in camp participate in camp, understanding that COVID does not pose an undue threat to young, healthy children and adolescents and counselors and even staff. So what has made sense here is to look at as I was alluding to before, to look at the guidelines, say which of these make sense to our population. That is going to be, first and foremost, the, identifying, the low-hanging fruit, like who can you identify as somebody who should not be among others. That's going to be your initial testing. Of course, it's pretty surprising when you do all this and it doesn't identify everybody, and that's the tests, while we're so grateful to have them because they're better than nothing, they have been problematic from the beginning, and they are especially unhelpful right now because these tests were developed with earlier variants and do not appear to pick up with the same rate of sensitivity the current variants. So you're more likely to deal with false negatives at this point in the game compared to earlier. People don't typically shed enough antigen early on in their infections to be detectable by these, and then you get a problem on the other end, which is that people will show up with positive tests well in excess of the time that they're contagious, because these, interestingly, these tests identify the presence of the virus, and so you can just have dead virus, bacterial. You can just have debris, and it might not be competent virus that could infect anybody, but you're going to detect that. And we've had lots of examples where people will test positive for weeks on end, but they're not suffering from the infection anymore. So that is why testing is of limited utility in this wave of COVID. Here at camp, I think our main focus, as I believe it should be, is on our obvious opportunities to limit spread. That's why you keep kids cohorted but still in groups, while you have people who have sick contacts eating separately at another part of the dining hall, where you have outdoor spaces where most of the activities are outdoors. You mask when people have symptoms. You test people who need testing, and you let people come back to play when they are feeling well enough to engage with their peers.
Right. Yeah. That's been really helpful too, because I think we were so fixated on the what does your test say before, and now we understand from you it's more about the symptoms, right? So if someone's not feeling well and they have symptoms, and they tend to be what we're seeing stuffy noses, some headaches, sore or scratchy throats. Anything else we're seeing?
Well, you mentioned those protocols. Like one of the things that has been so surprising is that actually we have seen a whole lot of protocols that are driven by the presence or absence of fever. And you probably, as a parent, and any
that's
parent
what we
out
used
there,
to always
any
think
parent
of.
who's
It was
out
always
here,
the fever.
That's right.
Yeah.
We would drive our kids to school, and they would roll down the window, and they would take our kids' temperature. And as a clinician in the office all this time, I got to tell you, fever is not very predictive of COVID infection in children. And it may be more the case in adults. I would have to consult with my adult colleagues. But there's actually very little, I would say, that will predict COVID versus some other cold that's going around. So that's interesting, because every year at camp we have kids who have colds.
Yeah,
right?
every single year.
There's nothing novel.
We did last year.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's nothing novel about that. Right. So kids have sore throats. They have fevers. They have runny nose and cough. We're in the middle of the Sierras. We get lots of pollen and other things blooming. So we are used to kids having symptoms. So there's very little actually that's unique. I would say that it's not as common in the pediatric population, but for COVID, everybody knows that if you lose your sense of taste or smell, you're on the money, you've got your diagnosis. But that's not really the case with any other symptom. There's nothing else that's unique. I would say for listeners out there, like if you're wondering, I would say that the triad of symptoms that I've noticed that are most predictive, it's going to be sore throat, headache, nasal congestion, cough, and body aches and fatigue. When you have someone who has been exposed to COVID, or now it's a rising tide everywhere in the state, and that's some of why Camp 1, your first session, was different than your second session, or why there was that spread, is because it is just the reality that all over the state we're seeing rising numbers. So if you look at the news, you see that some of the counties are on the brink of reinstating certain mandates based on their positivity rate for their tests, and but that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because we know that with the advent of home testing, there are a whole bunch more cases out there that are actually being reported. So I don't know how many fold more than are actually being reported are reality, but I think I've heard people say 4 times more, 10 times more cases than are actually being reported are out there. And interestingly, the real bummer about this variant is that it seems to reinfect people who've already had COVID or who are vaccinated. But maybe that's okay, I would propose to you, because it's not as dangerous.
Right.
It's not leading to the same rates of severe disease and hospitalization that the earlier variants were. Now, I do want to go back and make one point for listeners who are looking at the data as it's reported, the presence of symptoms has not mapped well onto infection. I know I mentioned that before, but while we use a symptom-based approach, we're using that symptom-based approach mostly as a way to take care of our campers, because we realize that the cat is out of the bag. And so since the only way to stop the spread of COVID would be to send everyone home and shut down camp, which would be to no campers' benefit, we have to tolerate some level of infection in our community and our communities at large.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we've seen, I think, pretty low numbers. I think we're at 13 out of, I had asked someone for the number, I think it was out of 330 people.
That's great.
Campers.
Yeah.
So that seems pretty reasonable at this point in our session. I hope it continues to stay at this thing, but I think that is because we are not just throwing caution to the wind and just allowing, like, we have kind of protocols for kids who we know have had a close exposure. We're notifying their families and also notifying the kids themselves and saying, hey, just need you guys to stay as a group. That's right. And when you're around other kids, so you're doing all the activities, but let's just be a little cautious. And we kind of keep them in this protocol for 3 days, and we keep the thing posted. And I think one of the things that we're learning that's been beneficial for kids is to just destigmatize the whole thing.
So true.
Because we even have we have a sub area for people who are not feeling well with symptoms of COVID or anything else, but are negative. So we had, and it was funny because they named themselves Undiagnosed Alley. Did you hear that?
No, I didn't hear that.
They named it. So, and we're actually kind of treating people at Undiagnosed Alley the same as anyone with positive for COVID. So those cabin groups, we said, just be careful for the next few days, because we don't know. That could, and it doesn't really matter. It's the same thing. It's just you had somebody with a symptom in your cabin. So you're just going to be careful regardless of what it is that it was.
That's right. And I will share that I have some skin in the game, lest anybody wonder if this is just me sitting apart from this. My daughter is in a cabin where there have been a couple of cases, and I'm not worried about it because I know that she will be fine if she gets COVID. And I would so much rather that she have COVID and be here at camp and enjoying herself and watching the stars. She told me how gorgeous they were. She's dragged her bed out onto the porch so she can look at the stars and the moon. These experiences kids cannot get in their daily lives most of the time where we live, and it's just it's so important for her to be making these connections after these years of the messaging being please stay apart, stay apart. Now we're saying please get together, please please make friendships, please get to know other people, please listen, please share. It's been wonderful.
That being said, one of the things that you've told me that really resonated is I think it is important for parents sending their kids to camp anywhere this summer to just recognize the risk, to understand that there is definitely more risk of being exposed to COVID if you go to an overnight camp, or probably a day camp as well, I'm assuming, or any place where children are gathering together this summer. But as you and I both believe, I think it's still worth it.
Absolutely. There are things, there's not nothing that parents can do. So certainly the vaccines have some benefit to children. It may not be preventing every infection, but it's still, these vaccines that we have predict lower rates of severe disease, and that's I think what people care about, right? Like most people don't mind having some cold symptoms, but I would say it is very reasonable to expect that a camper would come home from camp or would come home from I don't know, say a swim meet or any kind of travel. Anyone going on a plane this summer, anywhere you go, you can encounter COVID this summer, and that's the reality. But you can remember that the COVID of yore, so just 2 short years ago, is not the COVID we're dealing with today. And we're in a much better position. So if there are complications, which are extraordinarily rare, like I can tell you, in 2 years of seeing thousands of patients, I have had none of my patients have been hospitalized with COVID. None of my patients needed any antibody treatment. None of them had any serious effects whatsoever. I had 2 patients who were older teenagers who developed pneumonia afterwards, and that was treatable with a simple course of antibiotics. So I think it's just very, very important for families to let go of the idea that COVID is dangerous to their children. Okay, we have, as a community, as a society, as a country, a lot to deal with COVID. It is still very dangerous to certain populations. But for your kids, it's probably more dangerous to stay stuck in a rut, believing that they can't get COVID. Because your kids can get COVID and be okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, because that has been, I've had to shift my mindset as well, because I was, of course, I don't want any campers ever having COVID at my camp. It was
right.
Like last year we were just like terrified of it, right? And so now, having, like you, experienced just the mildness of their symptoms and the fact they feel crummy for a couple days,
yep.
and then seeing them back out with their groups and doing great at camp, I've just been like, okay, we need to, like, I'm not going to stop worrying about it. I mean, of course, the adults need to worry about it, but update our policies. And I really do think we need the kids to not be worried about it as well.
Right.
Like, not so that they're not thinking that it's a big deal. So that's what we've tried to do at campus. Say, hey, it's all no big deal. They're back. They're ready to join you again. There's nothing to worry about or whatever. But like I said, I think parents do need to be realistic. I know that, for the most part, parents have been really, positive and receptive and understanding about like the kids who went home with COVID and that kind of thing. But some of them are frustrated because, they had big plans right after camp. And having known that their child was exposed at the end of camp or something like that is an inconvenience. So I think just, one of the things I always talk with parents about is, if camp is one of many things going on this summer, you need to prioritize, right? Sometimes we can't fit it all in. And, not as much this year, but in the past, people are like, oh, well, they're in the baseball playoffs, and can they come 3 days late? And then right afterwards, we're leaving on this trip. Can we pick them up 5 hours early because we're getting on a flight? And it's like kind of really trying to maximize summer.
Right.
But the reality is that kind of figuring out, I know for many of our families, camp is sort of the kids' big thing of the summer. And so we always tell people, even in the week before camp, sending your kid to camp well-rested, healthy. We used to say, even before COVID, don't do sleepovers and stay up really late, like in the nights right before camp. Send your kid to camp, like at their best, healthy. And then when they get home, they're usually exhausted. Regardless of whether they're sick, they have been running for 2 weeks. So plan some downtime. So we've always said that advice, like just, you don't, and let them kind of process the experience. Some of them are sad they miss their friends. They want to get in touch with their friends from camp. So I guess that's the other variables that, we don't know what everyone's plans are, but if as a family you have a very important family reunion and you're planning on getting on the plane the minute your kid gets home from camp, you might want to reconsider camp this year because most of the kids aren't getting COVID, but they are possibly getting exposed, right?
That's right. And I think I understand where parents are coming from. They're raring to go. It's been 2 years of delayed gratification. I saw a statistic that something on the order of 80% of Americans planned on taking a trip this summer, right? So when I inventory my families about what their summer plans are, they're talking about these experiences. They are trying to fit in cram everything together back to back, and that's kind of a uniquely American characteristic and tendency. But I agree with you, both because when we have our kids just move on so quickly from one experience to another, maybe they don't have as much time to reflect on what it meant to them. So I would think, in addition to the health benefits, there's also a psychological benefit to letting children sort of sit quietly and think about what that meant to them, and let that settle in, and they can form their ideas and their memories, and not be dragged into the next experience so they might not remember camp as well.
Yeah, for sure. And then another thing I wanted to touch on, because, before camp, a lot of parents, not a lot, but I guess quite a few, were asking about masks. Some were like, did not want to see a mask anywhere in sight at camp the whole summer. Some were like wanting masks everywhere. It's like we have all different opinions. And we're just, as I've always been, we're just like, what is in the best interest of our campers and our community and everything here? And I want to just say that my experience has been, these kids are just fantastic about being flexible, right?
Yeah.
Like if we are doing one thing one way, and then we say, okay, you know what, we need you to wear masks now for a couple days when you're in these settings. They've been really good about being responsive to that. Or the kids who have been ill, but they're back with they don't have symptoms anymore, they're perfectly willing to wear their masks for a day or two more, just as they're recovering, to protect their cabin mates and that kind of thing.
That's right. It's pretty easy to set aside any medical concerns about the impact of wearing masks. Masks are safe and they're effective, and they don't lead to difficulty breathing. I've definitely heard from families whose children have asthma, and they're very concerned that it might exacerbate their asthma. There just isn't a basis for that sort of concern. They are inconvenient and are uncomfortable for some children, and I'm sympathetic to that. And so we try to use them in a smart, mindful way, right? When it's appropriate. Masks do work. They've been critically important in protecting healthcare workers and protecting vulnerable populations, and it's the transmission of COVID has been pretty good. I mean, the prevention of transmission of COVID has been pretty good with the use of masks. However, I have yet to see any studies about what this new variant will say, and I wouldn't be very surprised to find that they are of limited utility. Right. If you look at our experience with measles and other highly infectious respiratory diseases, these viruses, they hang out in the air, and they are hard to eliminate. And people are saying now, even with this this summer, as this variant spreads, maybe we've really felt good about being outdoors. It may be that outdoors transmission is happening.
Well, I guess I'm not a scientist, so I can't say, but I will just say, given that our camp is basically all outdoors, even our dining area is outdoors, there's very few places here where kids ever go indoors.
I know, right?
So they are outdoors.
Which I think is helpful, right?
Right,
because
right. So it could be less. It could have been less.
You're looking at, you're looking at various scenarios. Like, you're in an airplane, you're definitely going to be exposed to your seatmate. Like, outside, it's still possible, but again, our focus is not so much right now. For myself, as a pediatrician, as a mom, I am not so much focused on preventing the spread of COVID as I am helping my kids have a healthy childhood and adolescence.
Oh gosh, I love that. That's the quotable moment right there. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful chat. It has been so helpful learning from you. I have to say that it has been, I can't even tell you the number of meetings, webinars, things that I have gone to,
I can imagine,
offered by the American Camp Association and the CDC and so many different doctors and different places. And we have been given so much information that changes constantly. And so every camp going into the summer basically had to figure out for ourselves in our, with our population, in our setting, what were the best practices. And we've now had to pivot even partway into the summer. And, so it's just, I think we've learned that there's no predictability in this thing. And the thing that makes me feel better is I'm not just knowing that no one's getting really, really sick.
Correct.
So that's the thing. I mean, obviously you would never want kids to be, getting terrible illnesses at camp. And, this is one that I agree. I kind of want to just call it a cold now, because that's what we would have called it 3 years ago, what we're seeing now.
Yes.
And I think for kids, it's easier for them to just say, oh, I have a cold. I need to be away from my group for a little while until I'm not, going to be breathing on them and that kind of thing. So thank you so much for coming on today. This was fabulous. We'll have to circle back, because I'm sure there'll be more things coming up and changing as maybe even this summer goes on. I hope not. I hope we now have a good plan in place that can work at least for the next month and get us through August. It'll be interesting to see what schools do. Hopefully schools will also get to the point where kids can stay in school as much as possible and that kind of thing, because that is the best for everyone and for families. I think parents need kids to have these opportunities, and parents need a little time too.
Oh, that's a whole nother podcast.
Right.
The social dimension of the pandemic.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's been so hard for parents, and so I feel for them. But we're having so much fun up here. I mean, that's the thing too. Like you said, I look around, I'm like, look at all these kids having fun together, and it's a lot of work managing everything. But this summer, we're all saying it's worth it. We will carry on.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for being on.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
As always, you can find notes, links, and other resources related to today's conversation by visiting my website at sunshine-parenting.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for my email list so that you don't miss out on any of the great resources I have available for raising thriving kids. Hey listeners, if you enjoy the ideas I talk about with guests here on the podcast, then you might really enjoy my book, Happy Campers: 9 Summer Camp Secrets for Raising Kids Who Become Thriving Adults. In Happy Campers, I share research-backed strategies that I've used at my summer camp for more than 35 years and in my own family, raising my 5 kids. I cover ways you can create a happier, more connected, more positive family culture. And I specifically share ways you can help raise kids who are optimistic, kind, resilient, and are better at making and keeping friends. Here's an excerpt from Camp Secret number 8, Make It Cool to Be Kind. While our hackles will naturally rise and our protective instincts will kick into gear upon hearing about someone saying or doing something mean to our precious child, it serves us well to remember that, unfortunately, mean people will be a part of our child's world forever. Instead of jumping in to intervene and rescue our child from the pain, we usually serve them better by teaching them how to respond with compassion and curiosity. Launching a school-wide, adult-driven attack usually doesn't work because adults are notoriously bad at figuring out the root causes of meanness. Often, the kids perpetuating the cruelest acts are the ones viewed in a positive light by adults. Our kids' social lives are extremely complicated, and often the kid committing the unkind act is doing it at the urging of another kid. We need to encourage our kids to talk with us about negative social experiences, explore the possible whys together, and ensure that they don't get led down the road to meanness. I'm Audrey Monke. Thank you for joining me for the Sunshine Parenting Podcast. Join me again for more conversations about raising kids who become thriving adults.